Montana Territory, 1873. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the snow-covered plains, carrying with it the promise of a deadly blizzard. Frost etched delicate patterns on the lone stagecoach window as 19-year-old Florence Martin pressed her gloved fingers against the glass, watching her breath form small clouds that disappeared almost as quickly as her hopes for a new beginning. "Last stop before Miller's Crossing," the driver called out, his voice barely audible above the strengthening gale. "Anyone getting off here better move quick, storm's coming in faster than expected." Florence gathered her worn carpetbag, the sum total of her worldly possessions, and stepped down into ankle-deep snow. Her emerald green traveling dress, once fashionable but now frayed at the hem, offered little protection against the Montana cold. Golden blonde hair escaped from beneath her bonnet, whipping across her face as she squinted at the small collection of buildings that constituted Timber Creek. This wasn't supposed to be her destination. The letter in her pocket promised employment as a schoolteacher in Miller's Crossing, 20 miles further, but with the storm bearing down, the stagecoach wouldn't risk continuing. "You can wait out the storm at the saloon," the driver suggested, already turning back to his team. "They got rooms upstairs." Florence clutched her carpetbag tighter. The weight of rejection sat heavy in her chest, rejected by her stepfather after her mother's death, rejected by the Boston society that had once welcomed her family before financial ruin, and now rejected by nature itself, stranded miles from her intended destination. The frontier was a place for the strong and the wanted, not for lost girls with nothing but education and determination. Florence had convinced herself that independence was the only safe harbor, that relying on others only invited further pain. She'd build her new life alone, answerable to no one. That was the plan. The stagecoach pulled away, leaving her alone in the swirling snow. With each step toward the distant lights of the saloon, her boots sank deeper, the cold seeping through thin leather to numb her toes. By the time she pushed open the saloon doors, her hands had lost feeling and her lips had turned an alarming shade of blue. The rusty nail saloon fell silent as she entered. A dozen weather-worn faces turned to stare at the young woman standing in the doorway, snow melting from her bonnet to drip onto the rough wooden floor. "I need a room," Florence managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The barkeep, a portly man with a magnificent mustache, looked her up and down with suspicion. "This ain't no hotel for proper ladies, miss. We got rooms, sure, but they're for the working girls." "I have money," Florence said, reaching into her reticule with trembling fingers. "Don't matter none, your kind shows up here, there'll be talk, bad for business." He turned away, dismissing her. "Storm'll pass by morning, you can wait in the corner if you're quiet like." Florence felt the stares of the men, some curious, some predatory. The corner the barkeep gestured to was dark and exposed. Her chest tightened with fear and despair, but she forced herself to stand straight. She would not cry, not here. As she turned to retreat to the appointed corner, a deep voice cut through the renewed murmur of conversation. "She can stay at my place." The crowd parted to reveal a young cowboy standing by the bar. He couldn't have been more than 25, with clear blue eyes that stood out against his sun-bronzed skin. A light stubble shadowed his strong jawline, and though he'd removed his hat indoors like a gentleman, his sandy brown hair still bore the mark of the wide-brimmed Stetson. Unlike the other patrons, his clothing, though practical, was clean and well-kept. A sheepskin coat hung open over a simple shirt and denim pants tucked into worn boots. "That right, Owen?" The barkeep raised an eyebrow. "Since when did you start taking in strays?" "Since decent folks started turning away women in blizzards, Jim." The cowboy Owen stepped forward, his movements fluid and confident. He addressed Florence directly. "My cabin's not far, it's warm, and you can have it to yourself if you want. I can bunk in the stable with my horse." Florence hesitated. The offer seemed too good, too convenient. Her life had taught her that kindness usually came with expectations. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Owen's smile was slight but genuine. "Because my mother raised me right, and she'd haunt me something fierce if I let a lady freeze to death when I had a warm fire going." Before Florence could respond, the saloon doors burst open again, admitting a blast of frigid air and a snow-covered man. "Blizzards hit full force," he announced to the room. "Roads are already drifting closed. Anyone not in shelter in the next hour won't last the night." The decision was made for her. It was the stranger's cabin or certain death. "Thank you," Florence said simply, her green eyes meeting Owen's blue ones. "I accept your offer." Owen nodded once, then crossed to her side, respectfully taking her carpetbag. "Name's Owen Russell. Got a small spread just outside town." "Florence Martin," she introduced herself with what remained of her Boston manners. "I was headed to Miller's Crossing to take a teaching position." Owen guided her back toward the door, pausing to retrieve his hat and settle it on his head. "Well, Miss Martin, Miller's Crossing will have to wait. Nothing's getting through this storm for at least 3 days." The blast of cold as they stepped outside stole Florence's breath away. The snow was falling so thickly now that she could barely see 10 feet ahead. Owen's hand on her elbow steadied her as they pushed into the wind. "Stay close," he shouted above the howling gale. "It's not far, but it's easy to get turned around in a whiteout." Florence gripped his arm, fighting against the wind that threatened to tear them apart. Her dress, never designed for frontier winters, offered no protection. Within minutes, she could no longer feel her feet, and her shivers had intensified to violent trembling. Owen noticed her faltering steps and, without asking permission, swept her into his arms. Under normal circumstances, Florence would have protested such familiarity, but survival trumped propriety. She buried her face against his sheepskin coat, grateful for the warmth and protection it offered. True to his word, the journey was mercifully short. Through the curtain of snow, a small log cabin materialized, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, its dark shape barely visible in the storm. Owen shouldered open the cabin door, carrying Florence inside before setting her gently on her feet. The warmth hit her like a physical force, and she swayed slightly as blood rushed back into her frozen extremities. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A sturdy table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the single room, while a bed with a colorful quilt stood against the far wall. Everything was neat and organized, not what Florence had expected from a bachelor's dwelling. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Owen said matter-of-factly, moving to stoke the fire. "I've got spare clothes in the trunk. They'll be too big, but they're dry and warm." He pulled a wooden trunk from beneath the bed and retrieved a flannel shirt and woolen trousers. "I'll see to my horse and bring in more firewood." "Take your time." With that, he ducked back out into the storm, leaving Florence alone in the sudden silence of the cabin. She stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the day's rapid turns, then practicality took over. Her fingers, clumsy with returning circulation, struggled with the buttons of her dress, but eventually she managed to change into Owen's clothing. The shirt hung almost to her knees, and she had to roll the trousers several times at the waist and ankles, but the warm fabric was blissful against her chilled skin. By the time Owen returned, stomping snow from his boots, Florence had hung her dress near the fire to dry and was seated at the table, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders as her bonnet and hairpins dried alongside her clothes. Owen paused in the doorway, momentarily struck by the sight of her in his clothes, her golden hair catching the firelight. Then he cleared his throat and busied himself with arranging the firewood. "Storm's setting in for a long spell," he said, keeping his back to her. "Hope you don't mind being stuck here." "You've saved my life, Mr. Russell. I'm in no position to complain about the accommodations." Florence's voice carried the refined tones of her Eastern upbringing, a stark contrast to the frontier setting. Owen turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Just Owen is fine, not much call for formality out here." "Then you must call me Florence." He nodded, then moved to a small cupboard. "You must be hungry." "I don't have much, but there's stew from yesterday and some cornbread." As he heated the food, Florence studied him surreptitiously. There was an ease to his movements, a quiet confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. Yet there was something else too, a wariness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, a tension in his shoulders that suggested he wasn't entirely at ease with her presence. Owen Russell was a puzzle, a young cowboy living alone in a well-kept cabin, offering shelter to a stranger with no apparent ulterior motive. In Florence's experience, such puzzles usually concealed unpleasant truths. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, accepting the bowl of stew he offered. 4 years, Owen sat across from her, his own bowl steaming. "Came out from Pennsylvania after the war, looking for something different." Did you fight? The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. Owen's eyes flickered, a shadow passing through them. Yes, though most days I try to forget that part of my life. Florence recognized the pain in his voice. It echoed her own determination to leave the past behind. I understand wanting to start fresh. That's what I hope to do in Miller's Crossing. Teaching school. She nodded. It seemed safe, respectable, a way to support myself without. She stopped, realizing she was saying too much. Without depending on anyone else, Owen finished for her, surprising her with his perception. The frontier's a good place for that. Most folks out here are running from something or looking for something they couldn't find back east. And which are you, Owen Russell? Florence asked boldly, the storm's isolation making her braver than she might otherwise have been. His smile was tinged with sadness, both, I suppose, like most everyone else. He stood abruptly, taking his empty bowl to the wash basin. You should take the bed. I'll make up a pallet by the fire. I couldn't possibly take your bed, Florence protested. You can and you will, Owen said firmly. My mother really would haunt me if I made a lady sleep on the floor. Florence wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. The day's events, the cold, and the warm food had conspired to drain her remaining energy. When Owen turned away to arrange his bedding on the floor, she reluctantly moved to the bed, sitting on its edge. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman, she observed softly. Owen paused, his back still to her. She taught me that strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but how much you're willing to give. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression softening slightly. Get some sleep, Florence. Tomorrow won't be any less complicated. As Florence slipped beneath the quilt, surrounded by the unfamiliar scent of this stranger who had saved her life, she pondered his words. Owen Russell clearly believed in giving, of shelter, food, comfort. It contradicted everything her recent experiences had taught her about human nature. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Owen's silhouette against the firelight, his head bowed as if carrying a weight invisible to her eyes. The blizzard raged for 3 days, confining them to the small cabin. What could have been an awkward imprisonment instead developed into an unexpected companionship. Owen proved to be well-read and articulate, challenging Florence's preconceptions of frontier men. They talked of books, of the war's aftermath, of the changing nation, careful conversations that skirted their personal histories while revealing their characters. Florence learned that Owen ran cattle on a modest spread, that he built the cabin himself, and that he occasionally worked as a guide for hunting parties from back east. What she didn't learn was why a young man with his obvious intelligence and capabilities chose such a solitary existence. For his part, Owen discovered that Florence was the daughter of a once prominent Boston merchant who had died when she was 14, leaving her and her mother at the mercy of a stepfather who squandered their inheritance before abandoning them when the money ran out. Her mother's subsequent death had left Florence truly alone, with nothing but her education to rely upon. By the 3rd day, they had settled into a comfortable routine. Owen tended to his livestock in the barn while Florence kept the cabin in order. They prepared meals together, played cards in the evenings, and took turns reading aloud from Owen's small collection of books. It was during one such evening, with the wind finally beginning to die down outside, that the fragile peace between them fractured. You never said what brought you all the way out here alone, Owen remarked, shuffling the deck for another hand of whist. Teaching positions exist back east, closer to what you're used to. Florence hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. My stepfather returned, she admitted finally. After the money was gone and my mother was buried, he came back claiming regret. He offered me a place in his household, her voice hardened, with certain expectations attached. Owen's hands stilled on the cards. He tried to force himself on you. It wasn't a question, but Florence nodded anyway. I left that night with what I could carry, used the last of my savings for the train ticket west. She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I decided then that independence was the only safe choice. No one can hurt you if you depend on no one. That's a lonely way to live, Owen observed quietly. Says the man who lives alone in a cabin miles from town, Florence countered. Owen's expression shuddered. I have my reasons. As do I. Florence stood, suddenly needing distance. The storm seems to be passing. I should be able to continue to Miller's Crossing tomorrow. She moved to the window, pushing aside the blanket Owen had hung to keep out drafts. Outside, the snow had stopped falling and stars pricked the night sky with cold brilliance. "It's still dangerously cold," Owen said, joining her at the window. Standing close beside her, his presence was warm and solid. "The trails will be blocked for days yet. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Florence kept her eyes fixed on the night sky, afraid to look at him. "It's not an imposition." Owen's voice had dropped lower, something unreadable in his tone. "I've enjoyed having you here." Florence turned then, finding him much closer than she expected. In the firelight, his blue eyes held warmth she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. "Why did you really help me that night, Owen?" she whispered. "The truth, please." He held her gaze steadily. "Because you looked like I felt when I first came here, lost, determined to stand alone even if it killed you." His hand rose hesitantly, then fell back to his side. "And because sometimes the thing we think will keep us safe is the very thing slowly destroying us." The truth of his words struck Florence like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed walls trembled, threatened by this man who seemed to see straight through them. "What happened to you in the war?" she asked, instinctively knowing his solitude was connected to those years. Pain flickered across his features. "I killed men, watched friends die, came home to find my father had passed while I was away, and my mother followed soon after." His jaw tightened. "And I brought back nightmares that make me dangerous to be around sometimes." "Dangerous?" Florence frowned. "I wake fighting sometimes," Owen admitted, shame evident in his downcast eyes. "Lashing out at enemies that aren't there. It's why I live alone, safer that way." Understanding dawned. "You've been sleeping lightly these past nights, worried you might hurt me if the nightmares came." Owen nodded once sharply. "Better to keep to myself than risk harming someone else." Florence recognized his confession for what it was, a perfect mirror of her own belief that isolation was the only safe harbor. They stood as twin monuments to the same flawed conviction, each broken in different ways but clinging to the same false remedy. "Has pushing everyone away made the nightmare stop?" she asked softly. "No," the word was barely audible. "But it's kept others safe from me." "At what cost to yourself?" Florence found herself reaching out, her fingers brushing his hand. The contact was electric, sending warmth up her arm. Before Owen could answer, a pounding at the door shattered the moment. "Russell, you in there?" a voice called. "Got word there was a stagecoach passenger stranded here." Owen stepped away from Florence, the connection broken. "That'll be Sheriff Denton," he said, moving to open the door. The lawman who entered stamped snow from his boots and nodded to Florence. "Ma'am, town's been worried about you. Stage driver said he left you here when the storm hit. We've been checking on folks now that the worst is past." "I'm perfectly well, thanks to Mr. Russell's kindness," Florence replied formally, conscious of how the situation might appear her in Owen's clothes, alone with him for days. The sheriff's expression suggested he was thinking the same thing. "Well now, that's good to hear. Road to Miller's Crossing should be cleared by tomorrow afternoon. I can escort you there myself." "That's very kind," Florence said, though her heart sank at the thought of leaving so soon. Something had shifted between her and Owen, something fragile and unnamed that she wasn't ready to abandon. After the sheriff departed, promising to return the next day, an awkward silence filled the cabin. The intimacy of their earlier conversation had been broken, reality intruding on their isolated world. "I should check on the livestock," Owen said stiffly, reaching for his coat. Florence watched him go, confusion and hurt twisting in her chest. It seemed Owen Russell was as skilled at retreating behind walls as she was. That night, lying in Owen's bed for what would be the last time, Florence stared at the ceiling, listening to his even breathing from his pallet by the fire. Tomorrow she would leave for Miller's Crossing, resume her original plan of independence and solitude. It was what she had wanted, what she still wanted, she reminded herself firmly. Yet something had changed during these storm-bound days. Owen had shown her kindness without expectation, conversation without judgment, and most importantly, a reflection of her own wounded heart. He understood her fear of dependency because he lived with the same fear, though for different reasons. Was it possible they were both wrong, that the walls they had built for protection were actually prisons? Florence turned her face into the pillow, breathing in the scent that had become familiar, pine leather and something uniquely Owen. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry. Morning brought bright sunshine that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling spectacle. Florence had risen early, changing back into her now dry traveling clothes and packing her meager possessions. By the time Owen returned from tending his animals, she was seated at the table, hands folded in her lap like a proper lady awaiting a social call. "You're all set to leave," Owen observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes. The sheriff will be here soon." Florence matched his detachment, though it cost her. "I wanted to thank you properly for everything you've done." Owen nodded once, moving to pour himself coffee. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," Florence countered. "The men at the saloon were perfectly content to let me freeze." A muscle jumped in Owen's jaw. "Then they're not men worth considering." Silence fell between them again, heavy with unspoken words. Florence rose and moved to the window, watching the sun glint off the pristine snow. "What if I didn't go?" The question escaped before she could stop it, hanging in the air between them. Owen went very still, his back to her. "What do you mean?" Florence took a deep breath. "Miller's Crossing doesn't know I'm coming. The position was arranged by letter. They're not expecting me on any particular day." She turned to face him. "What if I stayed in Timber Creek instead?" "And do what?" Owen asked, his voice carefully controlled. "There's no school here." "Perhaps there should be," Florence gathered her courage, "but that's not why I'm asking." Owen finally turned to look at her, his expression guarded. "Why are you asking then?" "Because I think we're both wrong," Florence said simply. "About being safer alone. I think perhaps we've confused isolation with independence." Owen began, but she cut him off. "You've shown me kindness when I needed it most. You've given me shelter, not just from the storm, but from my own fear. For 3 days I've felt," she searched for the right word, "safe. Not because I was alone, but because I was with someone who understood." Owen's eyes darkened with emotion. "My nightmares are part of you, not all of you," Florence finished for him. "Just as my fear of dependency is part of me, not all of me." She took a step toward him. "What if we're stronger together than apart?" The vulnerability in her voice matched the naked hope in his eyes. For a moment, Florence thought he would bridge the gap between them. Then the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the silence. "That'll be the sheriff," Owen said, turning away. "You should get your things." Florence felt as though she'd been struck. She gathered her carpetbag with trembling hands, fighting back tears of disappointment and embarrassment. She had exposed her heart, and Owen had chosen to retreat behind his walls. When Sheriff Denton arrived, Owen was polite but distant, helping Florence onto the horse the sheriff had brought for her. As they prepared to depart, Owen handed her a small parcel. "Provisions for the journey," he explained, not quite meeting her eyes. "Miller's Crossing is lucky to get you as their teacher." "Thank you for everything, Mr. Russell," Florence replied formally, hurt making her voice stiffer than intended. As they rode away, Florence didn't allow herself to look back. She had been rejected again, her offered heart refused. The lesson was clear, her original plan had been correct. Independence was the only safe harbor. Timber Creek faded behind them as Sheriff Denton led the way toward Miller's Crossing, talking amiably about the small town that awaited her. Florence responded automatically, her thoughts still in the cabin they'd left behind. They were an hour into their journey when the sheriff suddenly reined his horse to a stop, listening intently. "Riders coming," he said, frowning. "Stay close, Miss Martin." 3 men appeared around a bend in the trail, their horses moving at a trot. At the sight of the sheriff, they slowed, hands hovering near their weapons. "Well, look what we have here," the lead rider drawled. "Sheriff Denton and a lady friend." Florence felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. There was something predatory in the man's gaze as it raked over her. "Move along, Hardin," the sheriff said firmly. "We're on official business." "That's so," Hardin smirked. "Heard there was a lady staying with that war-addled Russell boy during the storm. This her?" "I said move along," Denton repeated, his hand drifting to his holster. The tension thickened as the 3 men spread out slightly, effectively blocking the narrow trail. "Maybe we want some company," Hardin suggested, his meaning unmistakable. "Pretty thing like her shouldn't be wasted on some crazy cowboy or a backwater town." Florence's heart pounded in her chest, fear crawling up her spine. These men were outlaws and their intentions were clear. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Hardin drew his pistol, but before he could aim, a shot rang out from behind them. His gun went flying from his hand as blood bloomed on his arm. "Next one goes through your chest, Hardin," called a familiar voice, "unless you and your boys turn around right now." Owen appeared on horseback, rifle raised and ready. His face was set in hard lines Florence had never seen before, all trace of gentleness gone. Hardin clutched his bleeding arm, fury and pain twisting his features. "This ain't over, Russell." "It is for today," Owen replied evenly. "Now go, before I decide the world's better off without you in it." The outlaws retreated, Hardin spitting threats as they disappeared back the way they had come. Owen lowered his rifle, his eyes finding Florence. "Are you all right?" She nodded, still shaken. "How did you?" "I followed," he admitted. "Something felt wrong." He turned to the sheriff. "Hardin's gang has been raiding farms south of here. They killed the Websters last month." Denton nodded grimly. "Been trying to catch them in the act. They move across county lines too quick." He gave Owen an appraising look. "Didn't know you could shoot like that, Russell." "Pennsylvania sharpshooter," Owen said tersely, "during the war." Understanding dawned on the sheriff's face. "That explains a few things." Florence looked between the men, sensing an undercurrent she didn't fully comprehend. "What happens now?" "I need to round up a posse, try to track Hardin before he gets too far," Denton said, "but I can't leave you unescorted." "I'll take her to Miller's Crossing," Owen offered, his eyes meeting Florence's. "If she still wants to go." The question in his voice was unmistakable, and Florence's breath caught. He was giving her a choice: Miller's Crossing and her original plan, or something else entirely. "Actually," she said slowly, "I've been reconsidering my options." The sheriff looked confused, but Owen's expression lightened with something like hope. "Miss Martin was just telling me she might prefer to establish a school here in Timber Creek," Owen explained, never taking his eyes from Florence's face. "Our town has enough children to warrant it." "That true, Miss?" Denton asked. "Town council's been talking about a school for years, never got around to hiring anyone." Florence felt a smile spreading across her face. "It's true, Sheriff. I think Timber Creek might suit me better than Miller's Crossing. If the town will have me." "Well, I'll be," Denton chuckled. "Russell, you take the lady back to town. I'll gather men and go after Hardin." He tipped his hat to Florence. "Welcome to Timber Creek, Miss Martin. I'm sure the council will be mighty pleased to hear about your interest in teaching our young uns." As the sheriff rode off, Florence and Owen were left alone on the snowy trail. "You followed me," Florence said softly. Owen nudged his horse closer to hers. "I couldn't let you go without saying what I should have said back at the cabin." His voice was low, intense. "You were right about everything. I've been hiding, not living." "We both have," Florence acknowledged. "When you asked what if you didn't go, I should have said what I was thinking." Owen's eyes held hers, vulnerability and determination mingled in their blue depths. "That I haven't felt truly alive until these past 3 days with you. That the thought of going back to that empty cabin without you in it was unbearable." Florence's heart soared at his words. "You believe me now? That we might be stronger together than apart?" "I don't just believe it, I know it," Owen replied. "When I heard Hardin threatening you, something cleared in my mind. All this time I've been afraid my war experiences made me dangerous, but today they let me protect you." He reached across the space between them to take her hand. "Maybe our broken pieces fit together, Florence. Maybe that's how we become whole again." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. "I'd like to find out," she whispered. They returned to Timber Creek side by side, the future unfolding before them like the pristine snow, unmarked and full of possibility. By the time they reached town, word of the encounter with Hardin's gang had somehow preceded them, along with rumors of Owen's marksmanship and Florence's interest in establishing a school. The town council convened that very afternoon, eager to secure Florence's services before Miller's Crossing could claim her. They offered her the position of schoolteacher with a small building that could be converted for classes and modest lodgings attached. "It's not much," the council chairman admitted, "but it's a start." "It's perfect," Florence assured him, feeling for the first time that she might truly belong somewhere. Later, as Owen walked her to the temporary room above the general store where she would stay until the schoolhouse was ready, he seemed uncharacteristically nervous. "There's something else I should tell you," he said as they paused outside the store, "about why I live so far from town." Florence waited, giving him time to find the words. "After the war I had episodes, bad ones. Nightmares that bled into daylight. I scared people." He looked away, shame evident in his profile. "The town was kind, but I saw the fear in their eyes. That's why I built the cabin, far enough away that I wouldn't frighten anyone during the bad times." "And now?" Florence asked gently. "They've gotten better over the years, less frequent, but they still come sometimes." Owen finally looked back at her. "I need you to understand what you might be getting into with me." Florence reached up to touch his face, her palm against his cheek. "I understand better than you think. We all have nightmares, Owen. Some just take different forms." He turned his face slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth spiraling through her. "Florence Martin, I think you might be the bravest person I've ever met." "Brave enough to suggest something scandalous?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Owen raised an eyebrow. "How scandalous are we talking?" "I was thinking dinner at your cabin tonight." Florence smiled at the surprise on his face. "I find I've grown accustomed to your cooking." A slow smile spread across Owen's features, transforming him. "I think that can be arranged, Miss Martin." Over the next 2 months, as winter released its grip on Timber Creek and the first signs of spring emerged, Florence and Owen established a routine that raised eyebrows but ultimately won acceptance. She worked tirelessly to prepare the schoolhouse, while he divided his time between his ranch and helping her with repairs to the building. Their evenings were spent together, sometimes at her lodgings in town, sometimes at his cabin, always talking, learning, healing. Florence discovered that Owen was a gifted storyteller when relaxed, while he found that her quick mind and gentle humor eased the lingering shadows of his war experiences. When the nightmares did come, as they occasionally did, Florence learned to recognize the signs. The first time she witnessed Owen in the grip of one, her heart had broken at his terror and confusion. But rather than fleeing, she had stayed, speaking softly until he returned to himself, ashamed and apologetic. "You didn't run," he had whispered, wonder in his voice. "I told you," she had replied, holding his trembling hands. "We're stronger together." As the schoolhouse neared completion, Florence found herself reluctant to move into the attached lodgings. The thought of sleeping alone again, away from Owen's protective presence, filled her with a peculiar dread. They had maintained propriety despite the town's assumptions. He always left before nightfall or she returned to town, their growing relationship carefully bounded by the conventions of the time. But something had changed between them, deepening into an attachment neither had anticipated. It was Owen who finally addressed what both had been considering. On a mild April evening, as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name, he stopped beneath a budding cottonwood tree. "Florence," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've been thinking about the schoolhouse lodgings." "They're nearly ready," she acknowledged, though without enthusiasm. "Yes, but," Owen took her hands in his, "I'm wondering if perhaps you might consider different accommodations." Florence's heart skipped. "What did you have in mind?" "My cabin." Owen's eyes were steady on hers. "As my wife." For a moment, Florence couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the simplicity and enormity of his proposal. "I know it's not much to offer," he continued quickly. "A small ranch, a simple cabin, but it's growing, and with the guide work I do in hunting season, we'd be comfortable. I could build onto the cabin, make it more suitable for—" Florence silenced him with a finger to his lips. "Owen Russell, are you asking me to marry you?" He nodded, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small ring. It was my mother's. Simple like her, but solid gold. He held it out, his hand steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Florence Martin, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you help me prove that neither of us has to face life alone?" Florence felt tears welling in her eyes as she extended her hand. "Yes," she whispered as he slid the ring onto her finger. "With all my heart, yes." Owen's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that promised healing, home, and a future neither had dared imagine when the blizzard brought them together. They were married 2 weeks later in the newly completed schoolhouse, the entire town turning out for the occasion. Florence wore a simple white dress ordered from the mercantile, while Owen appeared in a new suit that made him look younger and somehow more vulnerable. Sheriff Denton served as best man, having become a friend to them both after the encounter with Hardin's gang. The outlaws had been captured attempting to rob a stagecoach, Hardin's wounded arm making him easier to track than usual. As they exchanged vows, Florence looked into Owen's clear blue eyes and saw not the broken soldier who had retreated from life, but the man who had found the courage to reach out when she needed him most. The man who had shown her that independence didn't have to mean isolation. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the traveling preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." Owen's kiss was gentle, respectful of their public setting, but his eyes promised more when they were alone. The town celebrated with a feast and dancing at the saloon, now scrubbed and decorated for the occasion. As Florence and Owen moved through their first dance as husband and wife, she leaned close to whisper in his ear. "Do you remember what you said the night we met, about your mother teaching you that strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but how much you're willing to give?" Owen nodded, his hand warm against the small of her back. "I think she was right," Florence continued, "but I also think true strength is knowing when to let someone else carry part of your burden, when to accept help as well as give it." "You've taught me that," Owen acknowledged, his voice rough with emotion. "Every day since you walked into that saloon." As evening fell, they slipped away from the celebration, riding double on Owen's horse back to the cabin, their home now, not just his. Florence's belongings had been moved there the day before, her books mingling with his on the small shelf, her teaching materials stacked neatly on the table. Owen lifted her from the horse with gentle hands, but instead of setting her down, he carried her to the cabin door. "I believe this is traditional," he said with a smile, pushing the door open and carrying her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Fresh spring wildflowers adorned the table, the bed was made with new linens, and candles cast a warm glow over everything. "When did you do all this?" Florence asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Had some help from the ladies in town while you were getting ready," Owen admitted, setting her on her feet. They seemed to think a bride deserved something special on her wedding night. Florence felt a blush rising to her cheeks at the mention of the night ahead. Despite their closeness over the past months, they had maintained certain boundaries, saving this intimacy for marriage. Owen sensed her sudden shyness. "We have all the time in the world," he assured her, taking her hands in his. "Nothing needs to happen that you're not ready for." His consideration only deepened her love for him. "I'm not afraid," Florence told him honestly, "not with you." Later, as they lay together in the soft darkness, Florence nestled against Owen's chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. Outside, the night creatures sang their spring songs, and a gentle rain began to patter against the roof. "I used to hate that sound," Owen murmured, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "After the war. Reminded me of gunfire." Florence raised her head to look at him, and now. His smile was peaceful, the shadows in his eyes receded. "Now it sounds like blessing, like life continuing." He kissed her forehead. "Like hope." Florence settled back against him, contentment washing through her. She had traveled west seeking independence, determined to need no one. Instead, she had found something far more precious, interdependence with a man who understood both strength and vulnerability, because he lived with both himself. "I love you, Owen Russell," she whispered, his arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Florence Russell, more than I ever thought possible." As they drifted toward sleep, the rain a gentle lullaby on the roof of the cabin that had sheltered them through the blizzard and would now shelter their shared life, Florence knew they had both found what they truly needed. Not isolation disguised as independence, but connection that honored their individual strength while creating something greater together. The cabin that had once been Owen's solitary retreat had become something else entirely, a true home, warm with shared purpose and mutual understanding. A place where two wounded souls had discovered that in caring for each other, they had finally learned to heal themselves.